Hi everybody. In this third video we're looking at Zechariah. He was an old man and he had prayers. He was a priest. He said some special prayers, and he's a really significant character around the cradle of Christ. So if you want to read Luke chapter 1 verses 5 to 25 and then 57 through to 80, you'll get a flavour of the story. You'll be reminded of his place and his purpose. So towards the end of Herod the Great, there was a couple and they lived not far from Jerusalem, Zechariah and Elizabeth, and we know that they were both old. Now, Elizabeth was from a very priestly family, and on becoming a priest, it meant that they lived on and they farmed the lands where the animals were raised and bred and farmed for temple work. And their income was also supplemented through the tithes and the offerings which were received through the temple as well. Now, like all great priests, Zechariah had to go to the temple in Jerusalem 3 times a year to help out with the general running and also the festivals, which were really significant and still are. And these brought thousands and thousands of Jewish people into Jerusalem from all over the country. And these were really prosperous days, and they were days of great celebration. Now, the priests had to be ready to be called to the temple for the 1 week of special duties twice a year that was assigned under the order of Abijah, which is in verse 5. But there were about 800 priests, and they didn't it wasn't almost like their turn. What happened was lots were cast. They didn't have a plan, so they knew as and when they'd be going. They just had to be ready for as and when that lot was called and their name came up. And sometimes the name never ever came up because of lots. And sometimes you got to do it more than once. But it was a chance in a lifetime to have that opportunity to serve in the temple. Now, as we know, both Zechariah and Elizabeth were very old. They were as old or older than King Herod himself, and they'd lived in Jerusalem where the king had his palace. And there were about 20,000 priests in Judea at that time. Herod had not been particularly friendly to them. He had reason to be suspicious of the priests. And for centuries, the high priest, when appointed, held that post for life. But Herod didn't like the sound of that, and that was one of the first things that he changed. In the past, the high priest had been virtually the head of state, and that was, of course, in the absence of a king or governor. But when they got a king and a governor, Herod did not want any competition whatsoever. Herod was made king of the Jews in Rome, and the high priest was his main rival. So to offset this potential trouble causer, Herod appointed his own nominees to the post, and he dismissed and appointed them as and when he saw fit. Those who were ex-priests under his regime came with their families to be known as the chief priests, and we meet those in all 4 Gospels. So priests like Zechariah didn't regard Herod with much favour, even if he brought the country prosperity, which he did, and we looked at that last time. Still, they were won over to some degree by the fact that among his many great building projects, his most prestigious building was the new temple in Jerusalem. Herod courted the favour of the priests by training 1,000 of them. He trained them to be masons and carpenters to work on the building. And again, that's something I mentioned last time. And in this way, there was no sacrilege committed by the builders. There was nobody trespassing into the sacred areas. Now, Zechariah would be about 50 years of age when this work began. For 10 years, the temple was like a building site. And Zechariah, like all the other priests, had to function as best as he could and control the crowds up for the coming festivals. Now, that disruption ended there for 3 or 4 years before our story. Building still went on here and there for another 70 years to finish off the buildings, it took a long, long time. But it was a magnificent building, better than Solomon's and better than the second temple that replaced it after the exile. So as Zechariah got older, he performed his priestly duties in really, really beautiful surroundings. But they had one deep sorrow, Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. They had no children. And this was a great reproach in that society. And it was assumed to be some kind of judgment on the couple, especially the woman. And this was so hard to understand. Now, they were so devout and they showed their faith in God by leading such wonderful lives. You see this in verse 6. They kept out of trouble's way. They did as they were told. They kept out of Herod's way, and they imagined that they would see out their time in peace and in quiet. Now, as it happened, Zechariah's big moment came round towards the end of this prosperous but cruel reign of Herod the Great. He was sent down and he was nervous, and he went to the temple in Jerusalem to be there for the Sabbath and to begin that week of duty that I've just mentioned. And he was chosen by lot to burn incense on the golden altar in the holy place. We see that in verse 9. So he'd won the lottery in priestly terms. There was no greater honour, no greater responsibility than to do this. He performed all the prescribed ablutions to make sure he was holy enough to enter the holy place. And he put on a special, heavily adorned garment. So he went into the temple of the Lord while the crowd of people outside prayed during the hour when the incense was burnt. It's verse 9 and verse 10. And all went well until he was right inside with no one else present. So let's now think about this husband and his prayers. John 11 to 13. An angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing on the right of the altar where the incense was burnt. When Zechariah saw him, he was alarmed and felt afraid. But the angel said to him, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah. God has heard your prayer, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. You are to name him John." Now, the childless man was to become a father in old age. His elderly wife was to become a mother. And while he was trying to come to terms with the thunderbolt of fact he was given, the angel seemed to think it could only be good news, and continued, "How glad and happy you will be, and how happy many others will be when he is born. He will be a great man in the Lord's sight." And that's verses 14 and 15. So the boy will grow to be a great man. And then the angel goes on. He must not drink any wine or strong drink. From his very birth, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit. That's verse 15. So he is to be a Nazarite, like Samson. Now, the unreality of this grows with every single sentence. And he will bring many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. He will go ahead of the Lord, strong and mighty like the prophet Elijah. It's verse 17. Another Elijah. I know what that means. You can just hear him saying it, can't you? It means the forerunner of the Messiah. Now that is a wonderful, scary thing to hear. He will bring fathers and children together again. He will turn disobedient people back to the way of thinking of the righteous. He will get the Lord's people ready for him. It's verse 17. Wow. It's like what Malachi said. The very words. These are prophetic words. So he was unable to contain himself. and he blurts out, "How shall I know if this is so? I am an old man, and my wife is old also." This is what he said, but it seems that was not what was meant. Now, the angel said, "God has heard your prayer." So the Bible here suggests that he got used to his prayers not being answered. Things were now comfortable. Now, maybe he didn't want that prayer answered. The angel was perhaps messing things up. It was too late, according to Zechariah. How many years had he suffered? How many years had he and his wife suffered and thought, God is not listening to us? So maybe he'd steered away from the thoughts of ever becoming a parent. Maybe he felt that he'd been cheated in some way over the years, and it was a little bit too little too late. They would have waited for months and months and years, and no doubt that put a strain on their relationship. He might even have thought of divorcing Elizabeth, because that's something that did happen as well. But maybe their common desire to just serve God kept them from doing that. It might have been difficult with his in-laws, both sides of in-laws, waiting and waiting for grandchildren that never appeared. Maybe they were worried and tense and irritable and sad. Maybe they looked at their family members and were disappointed in some way in how they turned out. Yes, they served God, but maybe they wanted them to do something else instead. Maybe they wondered if their children were being punished because of their mistakes. Sometimes it tended to undermine trust as well. So this experience of Elizabeth and Zechariah must have been so difficult. So for him to suddenly have this prayer seemingly answered is a big thing, and it would have been terrifying. Maybe they'd been jealous of other people for all these years. Maybe they felt devalued. Maybe they'd even lost friends over the years. They prayed and prayed and prayed, but to no avail. But they had weathered all that, and they'd come to a place of accommodation. They'd just come to a place of acceptance. And all of a sudden, what they'd accepted, well, it's like a rug being pulled from underneath them. They'd got on with their lives, and now their lives were just going to change quite dramatically. A forgotten prayer maybe caught up with Zechariah, and he did not much like the idea of his forgotten prayer being answered. So it's not unusual for us to give up on prayer, is it? Many of us have prayers that we prayed once and then we don't pray them ever again. Some of them, no doubt, were silly prayers, foolish prayers, and we might even be a bit embarrassed of the things that we've prayed for in the past as well. C.S. Lewis writes this: "If God had granted all the silly prayers I've made, where should I be now?" Some were pretty selfish, and we are glad God knew better than we knew ourselves and mercifully did not answer. Some, however, were not like that. We were on the right track, but we have conveniently forgotten about them. We've begun to doubt after so many unanswered prayers. We would not be too keen on them being answered now. We were younger then. We are older now. We were committed to values then and no longer committed to those values now. We were in different circles then, and we are most sophisticated now. It would be quite inconvenient if that prayer were resurrected and answered. It has bred in us some cynicism. So it may be, though, that if we are to fulfill the will of God, for us now, it will mean remembering past prayers and bringing them up to date. I don't suppose you'll get an angel jolt like Zechariah did, but who knows? How would you feel if you were Zechariah? How would you feel if you were Elizabeth? Now, with Zechariah, this angel came and opened up this whole subject again. Have you ever been in a situation where a subject's opened up again and it was painful at the time and you really don't want to go over it again? Well, I imagine this might be how Zechariah felt. How shall I know if this is so? He asks. I'm an old man. My wife is old too. Hope deferred makes the heart sick and undermines faith. Although he asked a question, he was really saying, I hope that you're wrong. He had had this conversation probably inwardly as the angel spoke. This was not a well-received point of information. I am Gabriel, the angel answered. I stand in the presence of God, who sent me. God sent me to speak to you and to tell you this good news. But you have not believed my message, which will come true in the right time. Because you've not believed, you will be unable to speak and you will remain silent until the day my promise to you comes true. That's verses 19 and 20. So when he heard this, he was totally dumb. He tried to speak, but nothing would come out. You can imagine him being completely demoralized and scared. He finished his task, stumbled to the entrance and came out into the bright sunlight. Verse 21 and 22. In the meantime, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he was spending such a long time in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. And so they knew that he'd seen a vision in the temple. Unable to say a word, he made signs to them with his hands. Can you just picture those signs he was making? He disrobed, somehow managed to carry on till the end of the week of his duty. Can you imagine? And then verse 23, when his period of service in the temple was over, Zechariah went back home. Can you imagine going home? And his great moment seemed to have ended in disaster. He will have waited his life to have served there in that temple, and it seems to all have gone quite wrong. He's lost the power of speech and hearing, and yet there was a promise that they would have a child. We can only imagine how he conveyed that to his wife, Elizabeth, what he'd experienced in the temple. It might be worth wondering how the Lord may have spoken to you in your lives and how you've conveyed that to other people, especially if it's been a life-changing moment. Now, it's not hard to envisage how he managed to cope with his loss of speech and hearing. It must have been really, really difficult. But it must have been hard, not just at home, but in the village that he went back to as well. Everything had to be done by signs, or maybe written on a slate or written in the dust, maybe with his stick or with his finger. So let's now look at this idea of the child and his role. Verse 24-25. Sometime later, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and did not leave the house for 5 months. Now, at last, the Lord has helped me, she said. He has taken away my public disgrace. Now, in the 6th month of a pregnancy, a relative of theirs turns up in Nazareth. They arrive with another stranger, another strange story, as learned later. Now, this cousin who was little more than a girl, had also had a visit from the same angel Gabriel. She too was to have a child without a husband and much, much, much younger. And when she came through the door, and before anything, not even a greeting was exchanged, his wife Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and she says in a loud voice, "You are the most blessed of all women, and blessed is the child you shall bear. Why should this great thing happen to me, that my Lord's mother comes to visit me? For as soon as I heard your greeting, the baby within me jumped with gladness. How happy you are to believe that the Lord's message to you will come true." So clearly Zechariah and Elizabeth Zechariah saw that his wife Elizabeth had recognised what Gabriel had said to him about the Lord who was to come and was being fulfilled. And that was all to be fulfilled with the pregnancy of that young cousin. And then inspiration seemed to come to that young cousin, and she uttered this song of praise and gratitude. And Zechariah had learned the words. He knew it like a great song in their histories past. Now, 3 months, Mary stays there with the old woman and the young woman. So old and young together. This is a joining of generations through that which is yet to be born. And the young woman talks and talks and seemed to Zechariah to be just really happy and then deeply thoughtful. And he got such news reported to him as Elizabeth was able to write or sign for him. Remember, he still can't speak or hear. And then verse 57, 58. When the time came for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbours and relatives heard how wonderfully good the Lord had been to her, and they all rejoiced with her. So far, so good. Zechariah did what he could to help and enter into the celebrations and the merriment, but he still couldn't speak. What you've got there is a real community celebration. Something good has happened, something strange, something miraculous, and the whole of the community see it together. That must have been just awe-inspiring. Verse 59, 60. When the baby was a week old, however, they came to circumcise him, and they were going to name him Zechariah after his father. But his mother said, no, his name is to be John. And I can imagine Zechariah being so relieved, and he was probably lip reading those words. The neighbours were not easily put off. They said to her, but you've no relatives with that name. Remember, the child's name is very, very important. Then they made signs to the father, asking him what he would like the boy to be called. His name is John, he writes. And they would have been so surprised. Why doesn't he want to name his child after himself? His child is his legacy. But actually, this is the legacy of the Lord Almighty. So at that moment, Zechariah was able to speak again, and he started praising God. And the neighbours were all filled with fear. And the news about these things, it says, spread all over the territory, all over the country, all over Judea. Everyone who heard of it thought about it and asked, what is this child going to be? For it was plain that the Lord's power was upon him. That's verse 61 through to 66. So let's think about the change then, the change in that old man. Zechariah, he has realised how blessed he's been. And he realised that even though some of his senses were taken away from him. I wonder whether he'd been a talkative man before he lost the ability to speak. I wonder whether he was the kind of person that walked into a room and just suddenly started talking to anybody and then never stopped. We all know people like that, don't we? I wonder whether he was a person who was a very good listener. I wonder whether he was a person who moved conversations back and forth. Was he domineering in conversation? Was he the kind of person who would talk to anybody but always wanted the last word? If so, he'd got plenty of time to recognise how he'd communicated before. Now, James tells us that we are to be slow to talk and swift to listen. That's James 1, verse 19. The proverb has it that the more you talk, the more likely you are to sin. That's Proverbs 10, verse 19. But here we've got Zechariah. He's done with fear. He's done with everything that inhibited his behaviour. He's done with everything that had just kind of, all the stuff that he's had to endure. 9 months, it's finished. And he was cured out of his cynicism. He started to see things in a different way. He started to speak, no doubt, in a different way. His praise to God was different. And he started to listen into circumstances and to situations. This changed his life. It wasn't just the child that changed his life. It wasn't just the angel and what the angel said. It was what he lost and then what he regained that changed his life as well. So he was now ready to have this child, however inconvenient it was. And Gabriel had said, he will bring fathers and children together again, verse 17. And it's interesting that there is no place in the record about his son, John the Baptist, that relates to this prophecy. Could it be that this was primarily fulfilled in Zechariah himself, father and son together? Now, to him, John, to begin with, has been an unwanted child, and that's changed. The child was very much wanted and would be called John, as the angel had said. So he had to start all over again and start all over thinking about the generations that would come after him. Now, the generation gap, you might hear quite a bit about that. The generation gap is still there, but it needs to be bridged. And we need to bridge generation gaps as well. The children which bless the world today need to influence us as we influence them. We need to learn from each other as well. And we can never, ever give up on that. We need to bridge both ends, the very old and the very, very young. We're the ones apparently who are supposed to be wise. We need to show and start the building between generations. And this, I think, is what you see in this story. Zechariah's turn came to be filled with the Holy Spirit, and he blasted out his own prophecy that he'd been building up and up all this time. Those months of silence built up into a great prophecy. First things first, he spoke about the other child still being carried by their cousin from Galilee. He was the important one. He was great David's greater son. He was to show that God had remembered his covenant with the ancestor Abraham. He would bring in a new day and redeem and save them from their enemies. To all their and all their prophets had foretold this. That's 67 through to 75. Only after that did he speak about the baby in Elizabeth's arms in front of them all. All those months he built up the truth which needed to be declared. He would be an extraordinary prophet, a prophet of God, preparing the way for the Messiah who was soon to be born. And when it all happened, it would be like the dawn after a dark, dark night. Life would take on a completely different quality and meaning because God had shown his mercy and kindness to them and to the whole world. So Zechariah becomes more positive than he's been in a really, really long time. He was full of gratitude for all that had happened to him, including the stuff that must have been so tough. That's one of the best things we can learn. Even through the tough stuff, when gratitude was necessary, he could declare it with a loud and an open voice. He stopped complaining and he started compelling people to see and hear. I can just imagine the words of praise that he would sing out at the top of his voice. He'd been unable to speak, and all of a sudden he could. Can you imagine that happening to you? All of a sudden, that which was taken from you is given back, and you see things in a completely different way. So we learn, I think, from Zechariah, this character. We learn about gratitude, we learn about appreciation, we learn about things taken away and things coming back. We learn about confidence and a new confidence seen in small babies. Confidence and a new thing seen in the unborn child. We see something of the sacredness of life. And we become unhappy. We become unhappy when we see things around us which are not right and not of God. And maybe it's only in our riper years that we can start seeing and noticing, because it becomes less about us and more about the community, less about us and more about the world. And maybe that's something that happens to us as we get older, as we go greyer. So may God help us to compose our own version of Zechariah's. May we boost ourselves in confidence because of the tiny heartbeats, the little toes, and the girdle of babies who've yet to live a full life. And may we think about John as a baby and what he was going to live with and through, and how for him his cousin was so important. So that's Zechariah. The next video is going to be Elizabeth, the believing wife. So an old man in his prayers and a wife who believed. So take care, everybody. God bless, and I'll speak soon.